This is the third iteration of a public component of the Mellon Sawyer seminar, Racial Reckoning Through Comics, that I am, I've never decided on what our titles are, co-director, co-convener, partners in crime, but with my colleague Anna Marino and Rachel Williams, who is in the back of the room, and our extremely important collaborator, Esther Claudio. And so I want to acknowledge and thank them. This is, as all of you know who've ever put on any kind of an event, many, many people are involved. And it always seems misleading if someone stands at the front of the room as if, you know, this is their work. And I also want to thank our local sponsors, the Obermann Center for Advanced Research and its director, Teresa Mangum, and staff, who also have played a crucial role, and two institutions in Iowa City that I would find it hard to live here happily without. The one we're in, the Iowa City Public Library, a really great, much used public library, very helpful to us. And I think, as you know from the program, later this afternoon there'll be a book signing at Prairie Lights, our really wonderful independent bookstore, who's been very helpful and supportive throughout all of these events. Let me just, again, and this may be a little repetitive for some of you, so I apologize, but just let me say quickly what the goal of this year-long series of events. And again, there are 4 public events, but there's also a core group of us who've been meeting regularly in seminar fashion. And our goal from the start was a critical examination of the role that comics have played in the representation of race and ethnicity, recognizing you know, that has often been, especially in the past, pernicious and offensive, but also, so we aren't continually depressed by this, recognizing really powerful, liberatory, progressive work being done in the present, and even, you know, importantly, recovery work of work done in the past. I think you're going to get a sense of some of that today. And the other thing we were determined to do from the start is to bring critics and artists together, to you know, encourage the dialogue between, you know, often they're seen as if not enemies, you know, working in opposed directions, but to bring artists and scholars together in critical dialogue. And so, again, you know, you can see that that's one of the things we've emphatically done for this event. I wanted to note for people who've been with us on this journey for, you know, the last semester and this one, that one example of the kind of thing we've been invested in is this book that just came out, a collection of the comic strip Where I'm Coming From, that was created by an African-American woman, one of the few who's ever had a syndicated comic strip, Barbara Brandon Croft. So this has been wonderfully collected, but has a critical commentary by one of the scholars who visited us last semester, Rebecca Wanzo. And so this sort of mix of, you know, getting material like this that became fairly ephemeral, getting it back into print, but then also providing the kind of critical attention that it deserves. I was really pleased to see that with Rebecca's really wonderful work come out just the other day. I do want to say high praise for last night with Joe Sacco and Rachel Williams in conversation. It was a model to me of the sort of critical and creative dialogue that we've been seeking here. I found it, and I've heard from other people as well, illuminating, moving, often funny, and creating great anticipation for Joe, for your upcoming books on the Rolling Stones and communal violence. So get to work. We're all waiting. What are you doing here? I do want to reinforce, as I think you all know, that we now have, you know, a program today and tomorrow. I won't go through the details. The program is available to you. But I do want to emphasize that we have, with our guests for today and tomorrow, I shouldn't probably reveal this, but I will. When planning this series, we had sort of, you know, an A list and, frankly, a B list of people we wanted to bring. These are all the A-list people. These are the people we really wanted to bring, and we used a sort of basic but high bar criterion. We wanted to bring people whose work was groundbreaking, people who really were moving things in new directions, people who stood out from the crowd in terms of their work, their approach, and those are the ones we have. So again, all of them will get full introductions in turn, so I won't provide those here, but Mari Naomi, José Alaniz, Candida Rifkin, and Jorge Santos. I'm really thrilled and pleased that all of you are with us. I do want to again remind you that later this afternoon at Prairie Lights, you will be able to get books by Joe and Mari Naomi. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but I think you are among the very first people in the world to be able to get Mari's new memoir, which has literally just come out. Looks amazing. The timing was a little worrisome on that, but we've got them. And I know that Prairie Lights has copies of Paying the Land in Palestine for you as well. I did want to mention that just for those who have only been at the public events, that part of the seminar, we, as a group, had very interesting, productive discussions on work by our three scholars. We read José has a chapter in his book on disability and superhero comics on race and gender in relation to disability that we read. Candidate's essay on Ho-Che Anderson's King provided really provocative discussion of our group, and Jorge's essay on Miles Morales as well were part of our discussion. So to you three, warning you, you've got an audience that's well prepared, has been digging into your work before this. I'm going to now turn things over to my colleague Ana Marino, who will introduce José Alaniz. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Corey. It's been delightful to remember all the great things that are ahead of us and all the enjoyment we have yesterday with Joey and Rachel. So I'm going to introduce José Alaniz. And when people ask me about, how was life when you start in academia, I have to say I was very lucky because one of the persons that I met and I've been talking over the years is José Alaniz. So José Alaniz is a professor in the Department of Slavic Language and Literature of the University of Washington, Seattle, and I always say I envy you because you got a position in a university very near Fantagraphics. So that means it's a great place to be, very close to comics, the heart of alternative comics. And he's also collaborating with the Department of Cinema and Media Studies in the University of Washington. My own story with José goes back to the year 1998, September 26. I was in a panel early in the morning, 9 a.m., and I remember lovely Cecile was moderating my panel, and I was with John Barbiri and Randall Clark. I was speaking about Annie Little Orphan and Little Lulu, so it was my first presentation in English. I was super nervous. Then we were in Bethesda with XPS, was the ICAF conference, the early years. And after the lunch break, and after we listened to guest artist Strip Code from Slovenia, Igor Prasel and Jakov Klemencic, came a panel on comics at the margins, moderated by adjunct Charles Hatfield, that was still writing his dissertation, and there was José Alaniz. You were doing your PhD at the University of Berkeley, I remember, and you did a presentation toward a history of Stalet medium, comics in Russia, and I was deeply impressed by his presentation. So there were Amok also, the French comic artist, Olivier, but I was deeply touched by your presentation. And then, so we start talking, and it was delightful that we were able to speak in Spanish. For me, it was very important because I was feeling home every time I was seeing José Alaniz, and he was, speaking, knowing Russian comics. He has such a deep knowledge, so I was very, very impressed. Then, back on 2000, I remember you came and you gave a wonderful presentation about the dead body, Alan Moore and Campbell from Hell. So that was, I saw, wow, such a versatility. He knows about Russian comics in such a way. So suddenly he's in a panel about From Hell with Thomas Hing, and I was very, very impressed. Then, on 2000, I remember September, you spoke about Alan Moore Lost Girls with Gevis on the matter of the truth of sex, and on a panel on comics, film theory, and film. So I was super, super, super impressed. Over the years, every time I see José Alaniz, I'm super impressed by the presentations he does. I remember 2005, October, you were speaking about caricature and the incarceration of the case of the Slavic Sawyer. I don't know if I pronounce. And then in 2007, you gave a presentation on autobiography and the post-Soviet Russian comics. So over the years, and then you were, hired by the University of Washington. You were doing a career as a tenure track, until you got the position as a full professor. So then in 2008, you were speaking on a panel on disease and disabilities. So, and you spoke about that on the work of Chris Ware. So you were touching in every aspect of them writing your books, your academics books. So we like that much his presentation. And at that moment, I was also part of the executive committee of ICAF that we say, we need José Alaniz in our executive committee because he's so well-versed. He knows so much that he will be perfect to helping us to developing, the space of comics in the part of organizing conference. So he went to the executive committee. He joined in 2009, and he stayed there working diligently until 2017. And on that years, he was 7 years chair of ICAF. And I'm telling you, I know how hard it is to handle an academic conference. And I know how hard it was to organize ICAF from scratch because, we have to look for a site. We have to bring artists. We have to coordinate everyone. So, and look for the money, as we were saying. So, and everything. So I know this is a superman, a man who's been in academia and has such an abilities that is amazing. So he's been publishing books on all the themes I just mentioned. I was the lucky person, one of the lucky person who was able to see him in that instant, the first moment when you are presenting to others, when you are building up your ideas, when you have to exchange. And I saw him grow, and it's so beautiful to see him in that places, bringing knowledge, fighting for comics. And also, he's an artist himself. So there is, he also was in the founding board of the Comics Studies Society. So he's been fighting different fronts to make sure comics is part of our intellectual space, academic space. But he has also the creative side, the curiosity. So give him, many abilities to find dialogue. And he's also an artist. He did the Phantom Thumb and other stories where he combined prose and, his drawing. So there is this kind of new side of him that is very fascinating. So today he's bringing new stuff, and I love it. Comics as code switching in the Los Four and Friends Tales from El Barrio. So for me, that is also very, very special, the way he's going to bring us new knowledge. So thank you, José. It's been lovely to know you all these years. Thank you.
Wow, I'm going to hire Anna as my agent, public relations person. Thank you. That was an extremely generous introduction, and never been called Superman before, so that's cool. You also, Anna, were just bringing back all this nostalgia for me because, going back to 1998, I was a graduate student, and then meeting you, Charles, Mark Singer, so many people, and all of these people have gone on to such brilliant careers. And we were extremely, extremely lucky, I think, that we were part of that generation. Not the founding generation, because we had John Lent, we had Thomas Inge, we had all these other folks who had been working for so long, decades really. And then we were the beneficiaries really of their breakthrough, and then we were able to build really so much of what became comic studies. So I feel I was just incredibly lucky to have that opportunity and to have such a generous community of scholars. So thank you. The other thing that I think you point out is I'm very eclectic in my tastes, but I think that can also open you up to the charge of dilettantism. And my training is in comparative literature, so we tend to be very kind of open to all sorts of different kind of things. And so yes, while I did make my career, I built my career on talking about Russian and Eastern European comics, and that's what got me, hired. And well, it didn't get me hired, but it got me my first book. And then I've gone on to talk more about disability and superheroes. I'm always kind of going off in all of these other directions, and my curse, I guess, is that I usually have 3 or 4 different things going on, and I'm never getting enough progress in any of them. But so what I'm doing today is presenting on a new direction. It's actually not even that new because I kind of been working on this for a number of years, but this is the first time that I'm presenting an actual chapter from a project that I will probably end up calling Chicomics, Graphic Narrative and Chiconics Art from the 1960s to the 1990s. And this has been, I think, a very important, very personal project for me, getting back to my roots in all sorts of different ways and being able to talk about Chiconics culture, Chiconics identity. And so I was very happy when you all invited me. I'm very grateful to the organizers, Esther and Corey and Anna and everyone, and Rachel, everyone involved in bringing me over. Thank you, and very happy to be here back in Iowa. So what I'm going to first talk about then, and I hope you all will take me up on this journey. I'm going to speak more expansively than I usually can. I'm going to be reading, which I usually don't do, because I want to give you as much of the detail as possible. But I'm going to be speaking longer than I usually speak, and I hope you all are up for that. I hope you'll join me on this long journey into Chiconics art, Chicano comics, and music, which is where I hope we will end up. So, first of all, what I want to talk about now is basically, I got 2 different devices here. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the Chicano movement and Chicano art in comics, and just to kind of get us all on the same page, the modern Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, begins in California in the mid-1960s, emerging partly from the struggles of farm workers and working-class Mexican Americans, people, by the way, like my parents. Led by figures such as Cesar Chavez from the Farm Workers Union and Dolores Huerta, the movement used art, graphics, posters, murals, performance, and other media to mobilize the community for marches, strikes, protests, outreach, and other activities. And so this is very much a story about how comics, which is usually, or for long, not really been discussed as part of that arsenal for the outreach and for expression, how comics actually were always there. And this is just one example, I think, of that. So let me just start here. Writing on the poster art, the Chicanismo era from the vantage point of 2001, Teresita Romo touched on the shifting emphases of many Movimiento artists in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Quote, though Chicano art had begun by visually articulating the Chicano movement's political stance, it also had as a central goal the formation and affirmation of a Chicano cultural identity. In visualizing this new identity, artists became part of a cultural reclamation process to reintroduce Mexican art and history, revitalize popular artistic expressions, and support community cultural activities. The seminal Los Angeles Chiconics art collective Los Four, founded in 1973, represents that shift better than most. Described by Chon Noriega and Pilar Tompkins Rivas as the expressive foil to the conceptual ASCO, which was another major artist group of the time, Los Four pursued mural making, installation, graffiti, graphics, and other practices in a mission to support the development of visual art that represented the Chicano experience. In 1977, Los Four released a comics anthology, Tales from the Barrio. The collection featured some revisionist Chicanic-centric history lessons, while other works forewent that didactic approach to center on the street-level experience of life for Mexican-American youth, including their non-standard mode of speaking and language mixing. Some combine the 2 strategies. I don't want to overly stress the didactic versus street distinction, however, which could give the impression of a false binary. The fact is that all of the collection's comics were committed to, as Romo puts it, to both a cultural reclamation process as well as a reintroduction of Mexican art and history. In this presentation, I focus especially on two pieces from Tales from the Barrio, Saturday Night Bust by Ricardo Navarrete and Leo Limón, and El Corrido de la Huelga by Carlos Almaraz, Limón, and Luis Valdés. I am primarily interested in how these works incorporate Spanglish and LA Chicanic slang to further an ideological critique of mainstream Anglo society metonymized as proper English, and to celebrate a culturally unique hybrid form of expression. I argue that the political and aesthetic stakes of code switching in these works marks an emancipatory moment in Chicanx comic art and advances the notion that a framework of language mixing helps us better understand the transmedial and particularly the musical potentialities of graphic narrative. So, part one, Los Fantastic Four. The origins, development, and dissolution of Los Four are relatively well documented, in particular, the work and tragically short life of co-founder Carlos Almaraz, who died of AIDS in 1989 at age 48, has received much scholarly attention. Los Four originally consisted of Almaraz, Roberto Beto de la Rocha, Frank Romero, and Gerbert Magu Luján. These were next-generation Chicanx artists, educated in colleges and art schools, including at LA's Olditch College of Art and Design. Assimilated to different degrees, the members of Los Four straddled varying communities, constituencies, and convictions. As Almaraz's widow, Elsa Almaraz, described their interpersonal dynamics, quote, each was affected by the cultural politics of Chicanismo, but most importantly came to the group with a vastly different viewpoint born of distinct personalities. The challenge in poetry that became Los Four lay in bringing these disparate strands together to formulate a celebration of Chicano art and culture. In practice, this meant that the cultivation of their artistic expression was intimately linked to the intricate inner workings of their personal relationships. The process was not always harmonious, but it was always fruitful. They spent countless hours trading sketches and engaging in mental menudos, passionate discussions about art, politics, and Chicanismo. Almaraz's metaphor of menudo, a Mexican tripe soup, speaks of the group's ethos of cross-fertilization, the forced blending of ideas that don't always go well together, but when they do, they're delicious. And of course, as Chicanx artists in the 1970s, Los Four's very existence was a political statement. Almaraz especially threw himself into La Causa, seemingly making up for his assimilated background, after the 1971 death of a brother and a near-death experience with pancreatitis, likely exacerbated by a drinking problem, Almaraz met Cesar Chavez, co-founder and leader of the United Farm Workers in 1973. At this time, he also met renowned author, playwright, and activist Luis Valdés, founder of El Teatro Campesino, who similarly played an important role in Almaraz's radicalization early in the decade. In 1974, Los Four became the first Chicanx art group to mount an exhibit in a mainstream institution, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or LACMA. The show, titled Los Four, Almaraz, de la Rocha, Luján, Romero, proved catalytic for the movement. It is not an overstatement, declares art historian Karen Marie Davalos, to declare that Los Four was a watershed moment in American art. Part two, code switching, Chicanx and as code switching. And I have as my epigraphs a piece by Luis Valdés, an excerpt from the introduction to an important anthology from 1972, and a quote from Cheech Marin in Cheech and Chong's next movie from 1980. They both have to do with code switching and with the relationship that Mexican-American, especially Mexican-American young people have to the English language. He says, Anglo-America no doubt will resent the bilingualism of the Chicano. The average educated Gabacho will probably interpret bilingual Chicano literature as reflecting the temporary bicultural confusion of the Mexican-American. He will be reluctant to accept in the Chicano poet what he proudly accepts in a T.S. Eliot. Both are bilingual or even multilingual poets, but the former intersperses his English with mere Spanish, while the latter alludes in the highly sophisticated Latin or French. The second epigraph that I want to use here, I want to sing this because this is a song that Cheech Marin sings in Cheech and Chong's next movie. Mexican Americans love education, so they go to night school and take Spanish and get a B. Right. He's a lot better than me. Before turning to Almaraz's comics with Los Four and friends, let us take a brief detour into a key facet of said works, the politics of language, and especially of code switching, i.e. the shifting of one language or grammatical system to another within an utterance in the Chicanx context of the 1970s. As discussed by Rosaura Sanchez, code switching is a particular type of verbal interaction characteristic of bilingual populations in the midst of social change. The code switching that we are interested in here occurs in areas where we find mass bilingualism, as in the Southwest, where code switching is the common communicative code among bilingual Chicanos who with varying degrees of proficiency function in both English and Spanish in informal domains during interaction with other bilingual Chicanos. It is during this dynamic period of bilingualism marked by a great deal of mobility, geographic and social, where role differentiation and appropriation prepare the ground for assimilation and language loss that mass code switching sets in. So code switching, as she writes, is a kind of transitional phase towards assimilation. Its duration is determined, she goes on, by those same social, economic, and political factors which create class antagonism and maintain social distance between the two lingual societies, as well as force the subordinate community to assimilate to the language of the dominant population. My reader will, or my listener here, will recognize the height of the Chicanismo era of the 1960s, 1970s as the era of mass social change, class antagonism, and increasing assimilation, which Sanchez is referencing. She goes on to discuss several examples of code switching in the Chicanx community, distinguishing it from borrowing. The former involves the incorporation of a foreign word into the grammatical and syntactic system of one's own language. For example, púchalo para atrás, meaning push it back, which incorporates the English word push and conjugates it as a Spanish verb. Borrowing, conversely, inserts a foreign word into the native language with no grammatical or syntactic language. For example, me dio un ride pa'l pueblo. He or she gave me a ride into town. For my purposes, both phenomena invoke crucial questions of of audience, rhetorical usage, and aspects of what Sanchez calls ideological code switching, all having to do with power relations, leading me to subsume both under the umbrella term of code switching, broadly defined. In short, Sanchez identifies three regimes of Spanish-Spanglish usage among the Southwestern communities she studies: formal standard, connoting education; informal popular, which is replete with code switching, indicating a Chicanic solidarity, informality, unpretentiousness, and lack of linguistic hang-ups, as she puts it; and finally, caló, a subset of the informal popular involving often vulgar slang, declaiming virility, defiance of literary norm, and artistic innovativeness, as she puts it. Caló has a strong associative link with the toxic machismo and gang culture of the era, as we will see. What interests me here is indeed the tremendous ideological weight placed on code switching and more generally bilingualism by both proponents and enemies of Chicanx cultural assimilation to the larger white society of the time. Among the many skirmishes in this culture war was the 1982 publication and reception of the memoir Hunger of Memory, on the right there, the education of Rich Rodriguez by a notorious English-only advocate and bugbear of the Chicanx left. Such considerations about the inadvisability and the identity-shaping power of code switching and use of caló have fueled pleito at roundtables and family tables for decades. And I write this as a Mexican-American who grew up in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas along the Mexico border, where, as Sanchez points out, such a mode of expression has long been simply the way most people talk. There is no doubt that code switching has towered over, and at least since the early Chicanx novels like José Antonio Villarreal's Pocho of 1959, largely determined the very question of where one's allegiances, or at the very least, where one's allegiances lie, or at the very least, how to signal them. For some, code switching is the oral equivalent of buenas garras. Note, too, how my own code switching right now, without translation, perhaps carries a tinge of rudeness, of willful exclusion, but only for those who are not already in the group, right? Pleito is slang for fight or contretemps. Buenas garras refers to the stylish mode of dress, most famously the zoot suit, worn by Chicanx youth, especially in El Paso and LA, from the 1930s on. As the first epigraph that I mentioned earlier by Valges shows, those who self-reflexively, even aggressively code switch for wider audiences seize on just this inversion of mainstream linguistic power relations as a challenge to the status quo and as an assertion of self-worth. Others take the matter of some Chicanx people's shaky grasp of Spanish as an opportunity for self-mockery. This is Valdes again from that same introduction. What is Chicano theater? It is a theater as beautiful, rascuache, human, cosmic, broad, deep, tragic, comic as the life of La Raza itself. At its high point, Chicano theater is religion. The Huelguiscas de Delano praying at the shrine of the Virgen de Guadalupe, located in the rear of an old station wagon parked across the road from the Giorgio's Camp No. 4. At its low point, it is a cuento or a chiste told somewhere in the recesses of the Barrio, puro pedo, right? So again, Valdes is not explaining or translating any of those words, which can be alienating, right, to those who are not already in the community. This utterance by the founder of El Teatro Campesino, whose legendary actos in the agricultural fields of California brought el movimiento to the people, literally in their own language, is validating, celebratory, but also irate, reactive, driven by an enmity built over decades of stigma, discrimination, and abuse. My own father, born the same year as Valdez, was swatted on the hand by a teacher's ruler for speaking Spanish at school. Perhaps this is why, as a second-generation Mexican-American, I find myself utterly enthralled by code switching, and especially by caló. No less than was Anthony Burgess by Cockney slang, or Alexander Solzhenitsyn by peasant Russian speech. It is, in short, el mero mero. I have chosen excerpts from El Louis by José Montoya, for my a poem from 1970, for my reader to get a sense of Chicanx code switching's pageantry and beauty, its musicality, its brutish intimacy, and masculinist swagger in poetry from this era. So let me just try to read this, and I'll try to give you a sense of the kind of the rhythm and the accent that this kind of language often is heard in. Era de Fowler, el vato, carnal de Candy, el Ponchi, los Rodriguez. The West Side knew him, Selma, even Gilroy. 48 Fleet Line, two-tone, buenas garras, and always rucas, como la Mary y la Helen, siempre con liras bien afinadas. But we had Louis and the Palomar, el Buick, los Mangos y Cuatro Suspiros del Alma, y nunca faltaba that familiar, gut-shrinking, love-splitting, asshole-uptight bad news. Trucha esos, va a haber pedo. Abusado ese, get Louis. No llores, Carmen, we can handle them. So it's that. I am so, thank you. I am just so enthralled by that music, right? Finally, no one has done more than the poet of the borderlands herself, Gloria Anzaldúa, to validate, promote, and identify this unique orphaned third language through her life's work. As famously elaborated in the premise to her landmark, Borderlands La Frontera, the New Mestiza, she writes, the switching of codes in this book from English to Castilian Spanish to the North American dialect, to Tex-Mex, to a sprinkling of Nahuatl, to a mixture of all of these reflects my language, a new language, the language of the borderlands. There at the juncture of cultures, languages cross-pollinate and are revitalized. They die and are born. Presently, this infant language, this bastard language, Chicano Spanish, is not approved by any society, but we Chicanos no longer feel that we need to beg entrance, that we need to make the first overture, to translate to Anglos, Mexicans, and Latinos apology blurting out of our mouths with every step. And sorry, I should have mentioned she's publishing this in the early 80s. In sum, then, the question of code switching lay at the heart of Chicanx identity formation and certainly what it meant to be a Chicanx artist in the 1960s, 1970s. Once more, the example ready to hand is Almaraz. His handwritten manifesto, Notes on an Aesthetic Alternative, composed while he was still studying at the Otis Institute, brings together many of the strands we've been discussing. And it code switches a toda madre. And let me just read it. This was actually a large piece meant to be hung up in a museum somewhere. El grito must be heard around the world. It must be loud and con mucha fuerza. El enemigo no es el gabacho, más bien es su Bank America card, su swimming pool, su arte. Nosotros los chicanos live in the stomach of el monstruo y aquí le vamos a dar mucho gas para que cuando eche su pedo se le rompa el fundido. Que no? They have enslaved us with their television, the English language, and their credit system, and we continue to support it. Basta, que se vayan a la chingada. El movimiento is our only hope. The movement is in the factories, in the fields, in our homes. The artist must be a part of it. He must make art that is cheap, simple, but alive and relevant. An art for gente who can't afford it, like a corrida, right? So again, very much in continuity with the other examples I gave before. Quite apart from the quasi-Marxist message of Notes on an Aesthetic Alternative, I am struck by how the former Charles Almaraz wholeheartedly embraces code switching here to signpost his bona fides as a card-carrying Chicanx sworn to la causa. It goes without saying that one does not find this sort of language at all in the 1960s New York diaries. A longer version of this actually gets a lot into what he was doing in the 1960s when he was still considering himself much more of an assimilated Mexican-American and was not writing this way at all. Again, language mixing and ethos of hybridity is shown as central to Chicanx identity. Turning back to graphic narrative then, what I want to start to emphasize are the ways Chicanx and comics itself as a communicative medium engage in, indeed are effectuated through like processes of language mixing, hybridity, in short, of code switching. It has long become the convention in formalist comic studies to speak of the arts practice in question as a chimera. Phrases in terms like word plus image, image text, visual, verbal, narrative drawing, cross-discursive, multimodal, multi-track, in short, language addressing what Hilary Shute labels as the inbuilt duality of the form. These fill the literature. Relatedly, as Martha Kuhlman reminds us, in comics, form and content are not separate, but fundamentally complement one another. Visual patterns and design strategies literally make up the narrative. In other words, a poetics of hybridity in various senses, to the point even of self-contradiction and destabilization of unified meaning, informs comics to its core. I probably don't need to tell this crowd that. I ask my reader to keep such tensions and dialogism as multimodal hybridity in mind as we examine Los Four and Friends comics. So, part 3, Tales from the Barrio. The literary arts journal Chisme Arte launched in fall 1976 under the auspices of California's Concilio de Arte Popular, a state-funded consortium of Chicanx art advocacy organizations, partly funded the journal Chisme Arte. Almaraz served as the journal's staff designer, secretary, and treasurer. Its inaugural editorial made free use of code switching to declare Chisme Arte as perception and concept. It's revolutionary art and art that is revolutionary, arte pobre y arte para pobre, armas y cantos. Chisme Arte is a Molotov cocktail for your aesthetic appetite. Among its interviews, criticisms, photography, and graphics, the journal included comics. In 1977, Almaraz's art collective and some collaborators dubbed Los Four and Friends released their comics anthology Tales from the Barrio, partly comprised of works that had previously appeared in Chisme Arte. It was funded by a grant from the Liberty Hill Foundation. The booklet was adorned by a flaming red cover sporting 2 grinning skeletons in a jalopy drawn by Frank Romero with calligraphy by George Yepes and Gilbert Luján. Perusing Los contents, one could see that Tales from the Barrio's 24 pages contained material ranging from, as noted, straightforward propaganda to family drama to crudely funny street realism. Tales from the Barrio is a remarkable historical and a relic and a fascinating example of Chick comics. Its fixations, its humor, its argot, its construction, its distinctiveness as a fiercely identity-driven mode of graphic narrative certainly startled me from the moment I finally got to read a copy at LA's Southern California Library for Social Studies and Research. There's really nothing else quite like it in the history of the form. Saturday Night Bust, one of the stories, with script by Ricardo Navarrete and art by Leo Limon, takes U.S. history puro pedo's code switching. This is just one example that I wanted to show you where they take U.S. history puro pedo and basically take a classroom where a teacher is trying to give a very official white version of California history, and this obviously very down young man there kind of talks back to her and says, bullshit, my family had a little ranch in Arizona, the Gabachos came in and stole it, et cetera, and basically uses code switching for a kind of pointed pushback against that official narrative. I'm actually not discussing that in any detail in this presentation. This is the one that I'm discussing. Saturday Night Bust, with script by Ricardo Navarrete and art by Leo Limon, takes U.S. history puro pedos code switching and ups the ante to irreverent and hilarious heights in a story of young wastrels doing drugs and drunk driving until a demonic white cop arrests and carts them off by none too gentle means to jail. The second half of the 4-page story serves as a series of practical lessons on how to survive in the slammer. For example, make sure you volunteer to serve food so you can eat, before ending with a don't do drugs, stay out of prison moral. That's the basic kind of outline of the story. But Saturday Night Bust's real business is its language, especially its caló, uproarious, coarse, subtle, and nigh impenetrable to the uninitiated. The first line, delivered by a young bacant as he empties another bottle in a pool hall, reads, "Chingas, that's it for me. You vatos have hustled me for 10 bolas already, man." And the code switching only escalates from there with such choice quotes as, "Finish your buds y no los fuimos. These vatos are flying high and they're looking for bad locura, a ver qué pasa." That's what you see here in that bottom tier as they're drinking down their booze. "Don't be so tapado," and "chicharrones de la madre" in the first 2 pages alone. Right? And again, none of this is explained, none of this is glossed over. It's pretty much you either know it or you don't. I want to focus on this page in particular. Let one key panel stand in for the piece's sweeping verbal visual mayhem. A mustachioed partier there on the top tier, offering some pills to his fellow lout, smoking weed behind the wheel, spots a police car trailing them. In the panel in question, his eyes expand to enormous size, with twin police vehicles inside them angrily flashing their lights as his hair stands on end. Higos latiznada, it's the pinche chota, he says. This is a better kind of image there. One could translate the words literally and get mostly gibberish, something like, "Figs of the sooty woman, it's the fucking pigs." But the brilliance of the panel comes from its cartoony exaggerations as well as its wordplay. For though unspoken, the phrase the authors clearly evoke as the first utterance is "hijo de la chingada." So they're kind of doing a sort of homonym there. So it's not "hijos de la tiznada," it's "hijo de la chingada." All right. So that's kind of what's going on there. So Saturday Night Bust, which is of course a vulgar curse. Saturday Night Bust is full of such jokey but serious set pieces as one of our Lost Boys trembles at a cop's scaly, fanged devil face filling up his car window. By the same token, the riotous galop is both funny and intimately linked to the casual violence and brutality these young men seem to expect in their lives, and they are not disappointed. Though nominally the artist of the story, Limón told me in an interview that he was responsible for much of the colorful language. I'm the caloist on that project, he said, laughing, because there's more calle, or street, in me. Ricardo didn't have that much in him. And I just say, you know, whatever. I grew up with La Familia, speaking Spanish in East LA, and I don't know, it just came along. That's what he told me. Whatever the case may be, as Tales from the Barrio's main artist, he illustrated 4 of the 6 pieces, Limón was a solid choice. Trained at the Otis Institute, the same place as Almaraz, though about a decade later, he had a background in cartooning, graphic design, and animation, but no formal training or interest in comics, lending his page designs the look and pacing of storyboards. Let me just give you this image again. When you look at a lot of these works that Limón does, they're not particularly, I think, interesting in terms of their design, a lot of the waffle iron kind of page designs. So a lot of what's going on is actually kind of happening more within the panels, I would say, as much. And there's another point that I want to bring up related to that. Several times, in fact, during our interview, he referred to Tales from the Barrio as a cartoon book and a coloring book, which I think tells you a little bit about what he was thinking. His labile, energetic figures by turns come off as humorous and darkly violent. It was perhaps Almaraz and Limón's lack of veneration for comics as an art form which largely inoculated them from the standard ways of designing and executing a comic book, both in the mainstream and in the underground comics press. And there's more to be said about to what extent there were links with the undergrounds in this era. I'm talking the 60s and 70s. I can get into that later on. Whatever the reason, the final Tales from the Barrio piece I will examine is a decidedly odd but fascinating work which thrillingly taps graphic narrative's own form of code switching, its multimedia potential, in particular its unheard melodies. And that brings us to code switching, part 3, code switching is musicomics, El Corrido de la Huelga. And so for my epigraph, I'm using a fairly well-known quote from Chris Ware, where he said versions of this in various interviews. When you read a comic strip, it's like reading a musical score. It's up to us as readers to bring the music from the score alive. In a diary entry from December 2nd, 1966, Almaraz marveled at the musical order of Gertrude Stein's poetry, which derives its order of beauty from the very structure of the language, proclaiming said musical order really dominant in the visual arts. He goes on to note how Alain René's in his 1963 film Muriel, is able to achieve a universal visionary language comparable to the universality of music. He favorably compares such capacities of expressionist art to abstraction's aforementioned boring lack of cohesion to one central idea. And this is something that he talks a lot about in his diaries of the 60s. Something like this urge to a universal visionary language seems to have spurred Almaraz years later to fuse the Mexican corrido, which is a form of narrative folk ballad, to the comic book. Together with Limón, he adapted Luis Valdés's Huelga en General, a rousing staple of Teatro Campesino performances and farm workers' rallies, as El Corrido de la Huelga, the relatively long piece which closes Los Four and Friends anthology. Here you have a picture of Luis Valdés and his brother Daniel Valdés performing with Teatro Campesino sometime around 1970. And just briefly, Valdés actually takes that song, Corrido de la Huelga, from a Cuban march that was written obviously to commemorate the revolution, and he adapts it a few years after it was written in the late 60s to the conditions of the farm worker struggle in California. Let me go ahead and maybe first of all play you the song, or enough of it so you can get a sense of how it sounds.
Hasta México ha llegado la noticia muy alegre que de verlo es diferente. Pues el pueblo ya está en contra de los rancheros y engreídos que acababan con la gente. Y como somos hermanos, la alegría compartimos con todos los campesinos. ¡Viva viva la revolución, viva nuestra asociación, viva huelga en general. El 18 de septiembre de los campos de Mellon salieron los filipinos. Y después de 2 semanas para unirse a la batalla salieron los mexicanos. Y juntos vamos cumpliendo con la marcha de la historia para liberar el pueblo. ¡Viva la revolución! ¡Viva nuestra asociación! ¡Viva huelga en general!
Okay, that gives you a sense of how the piece functions. And I realize I don't want to push the time too much, so I'll go finish as quickly as I can here.
No, you can keep going.
Okay, well, thank you. Always nice to hear. So the first thing I want to do, okay, so this just gives you the lyrics, but let me move on here. So they adapt the song, and they, as I argue, they're fusing the corrido form with the form of comics. So first of all, let's deal with the framing sequence of Corrido de la Huelga. While other tales from the Barrio fare traffics in mainstream Chicano tropes such as angry youth, police bus, and hijinks behind bars, El Corrido is quieter, more deliberate at 9 pages, and deals mostly with 2 men chatting from the far away from the big bad city by a rural road in the far-flung San Joaquin Valley. An unnamed young man has to take a sudden trip from LA to Fresno. On the way, his car runs out of gas in what feels to him like the middle of nowhere. And this, kind of gives you a sense of it. On the way, his car runs out of gas, and he basically wants up in the middle of nowhere. Crossing the country on foot, he comes upon an old man with a cowboy hat and a guitar sitting under a tree, and the two get to talking. When the younger man opines, "You sure got it easy out here in the country, old man," the elder tells him, "Joven, let me tell you about how easy we got it here in the country." And he starts to sing Huelga en General, which recounts the beginnings of farm worker organizing efforts in the previous decade. And I already played you a bit of the song. And so what ends up happening, right, is that it switches over to the older man playing, and let me just kind of just give you a sense of what that looks like, because he is interrupted after his game. What I want to do here, and I hope I can do this fairly right, is play you the song and then switch it over to the comics. Okay. Just have a seat, joven. Starts playing.
Hasta México ha llegado la noticia muy alegre que de Mellon es diferente. Pues el pueblo ya está en contra de los rancheros y engreídos que acababan con la gente. Y como somos hermanos, la alegría compartimos con todos los campesinos. ¡Viva la revolución! ¡Viva nuestra asociación! ¡Viva huelga en general!
Okay. And at that point, as you can see, there's an interruption where the young man, who has never heard this song before, says, "Hey, orale, what's that canción you're singing?" And so he kind of starts explaining like what the history of the song is and everything. So that's what I mean, where it becomes a kind of didactic process whereby this older man basically inculcates the lessons of the past into this youth who kind of has lost touch with the roots, I guess is the implication there. So he says, "What do you mean you don't know the farm worker huelga song? Pues hijo, ¿dónde has estado? Where have you been, son?" He answers sheepishly, "Well, I don't know, East Los, ese en el Barrio. To tell you the truth, I don't know much about farm workers. They don't give too much information like that in school," says the young man. So the old man continues the corrido. "Entonces you should listen carefully to this song," and provides a history lesson to the ignorant youngster from the Delano March right up to Chavez's victory against the Great Brewers in 1970 and on to the bright future. Okay, so with El Corrido de la Huelga, Almaraz and Limón deliver something both like and unlike what we see elsewhere in Tales from the Barrio, politicized, code-switching, heavy Chicanextainment, but with even more deviations from comics and linguistic norms. Dialogue again appears without word balloons, as it has in some of the other works, floating about the characters' heads and weirdly in quotes. Such techniques continue the subversion of mainstream graphic narrative conventions previously noted. That, along with the histrionic, cartoony figures and non-standard spelling of words and phrases like joven, have a seat, joven with an H, not a jota, and not too long with a K-N-O-T instead of N-O-T, imparts a cheerful vernacular mood, a naive authenticity. As Valdez puts it, a casual cuento or a chiste told somewhere, only this is not puro pedo. So a corrido is a song history, huh, exclaims the young man. Orale, I get it now, he says. But the story's chief aesthetic clue, one closely tied to its function as agitprop, has to do with how it masterfully conveys the tempo of huelga en general by unlocking comics' innate musicality, or so I argue. For here, the percussive ostinato rhythm I noted earlier in my discussion of U.S. history puro pedo is taken a step further by being tied to an actual song. This comes about through Almaraz and Limon's insistent use in 8 of 9 pages of the so-called waffle iron design, you can see it there, which divides the page into into panels of equal size and shape in the sort of grid pattern, right? According to the semiotician theory Gronstein, such a layout accentuates and regularizes the inherent temporality of a panel, since in comics time tends to equal space, or if you will, time tends to be mapped onto the space of the page. In his words, duration, whether short or like a 3 or 4 panel strip, or long, a 300-page graphic novel, is a natural dimension of comics narrative, as it is of other narrative. Consequently, so is, as he puts it, music. As evident from this section's epigraph, comics artists from early on, like Ware, have perceived the latent melodies in the funny pictures, as well as the role played by panel page design in turning up the volume, so to speak. The Golden Age master Will Eisner even likened comics to, quote, Morse code or a musical passage. All of this is taken in by the reader instantaneously, subliminally, as a matter of course. Moreover, as Gronstein avers in 2 key passages salient to El Corrido, when the layout is regular, so is the beat. The progression from one panel to the next is smoothed out in compliance with an immutable cadence. The waffle iron or grid iron design is remarkably well suited to any narrative or section of a narrative that itself relies on the stability of some element or in which a phase process unfolds. Another quote from that same book, thus the main ways of activating and reinforcing rhythm, repetition, periodic alternation, and progressivity can extend their effects and operate at the level of whole pages. This capacity arises out of a conception of the page, and especially of the waffle iron as a panoptic field, where all the images enter into dialogue with each other in presentia. The cadence is thereby underlined and not only informs the reading of the page, but also makes its presence felt from the first glance as a formal structuring principle. Okay. Other scholars have taken up this tune. Tim Summers analyzed music in the works of Alan Moore, where it plays critical roles both in the structure of the comics and in the diegesis, where Armel Blin Roland coined the term music comic for graphic narrative explicitly paired with musical pieces. While many superhero fans will recall Billie Holiday's You're My Thrill from 1933 embedded in the narrative of Moore Gibbons' Watchmen, 1986, we still see a still more unusual example of such in Laura Esquivel's multimedia 1996 novel, The Law of Love, which came bundled with a CD. And you were meant to play the music while you were reading particular comics passages that interrupt the prose of the novel. Or work with it. The novel contains wordless passages in comics form which the reader was to take in while listening to specific musical pieces. So returning then to Almaraz Limon's story, we see how the specific form of the corrido, I want to show you that. The specific form of the corrido enacted in its pages serves multiple ends: as culturally relevant aesthetic object, as agitprop, as historiography, as teacher-student exchange, as rite of passage, as bonding ritual, and more, all through the alchemy of the waffle iron comics musicality. It is a tale of la gente that la gente sings to itself to know who it is and where it came from. Identity formation, again, in all its multifaceted hybridity, reified as comics. In fact, despite being silent, El Corrido de la Huelga fulfills the traditional functions of the genre as discussed by George Lipschitz. The ballads build, meaning of the corrido genre. The ballads build emotional connection through a variety of clever verbal and musical devices, but even these presume a dialogue already in process, anticipating a certain knowledge among its listeners. The corridos emerge from collective dialogue among artists and audiences in a community that called itself into being partly through performance, end quote. This certain knowledge anticipated among the corridos listeners who at first don't know what they don't know, I submit is visually marked by the odd resemblance between our two protagonists. The fact is that the old man and the young man kind of weirdly resemble each other. They're two different versions of the same person at different ages. Both have mustaches and sideburns, sport the same build, and Limon renders them with similar expressions and poses. Furthermore, many panels show them sitting, looking directly at each other like a mirror image. This is to be expected since, after all, they're having a conversation. The preponderance of such clues, plus the fact that the men are not named, leads me to read the elder and the youngster as the same person at different stages of development, a dramatic realization of Lipschitz' dialogue already in process, anticipating a certain knowledge among its listeners. Such, at any rate, would explain why the young man seems to grow more and more lulled and registers less shock by the end of the piece than he did at the beginning, as if anticipating or remembering his own community's knowledge. A final clue appears at the end. After the song is over, the two men keep talking, still in the waffle iron, infusing some of the rhythm and political message of the corrido into their banter. I'm showing you the last page. Huelga en general bleeds into into daily life. Discussing Chavez, the young man asked, did he carry a carga? He holds up his hand in the shape of a pistol. A carga is slang for gun. No, answers the elder. He didn't believe that carrying a gun would change things, so he organized. He holds up his hat in a gesture mirroring his interlocutors. Out of the hat, there seems to fly the black eagle symbol of the UFW. Limon's art mirrors the dialogue. Instead of violence, organization, there is union. On the penultimate page, the student indeed anticipates the teacher when he concludes, posing like Charles Atlas. So this Chavez is a heavy dude, huh? Yes, you could say that. A chingon is his answer. That last word has no good English equivalent. Hard motherfucker comes the closest. And I saw on Breaking Bad, they translated it as badass, but that doesn't really work for me. It's kind of harder than that. I prefer hard motherfucker for chingon. The point is that the old man is using caló, which is more the province of people the youngsters' age, more evidence of their doppelganger identities, at least so I submit. On another level, the scene shows the growth of the young man from a state of ignorance to wokeness, his induction into La Raza's history and movement. This comes about not just through passively listening to the corrido, it is crucially in the dialogue, the question and answer that comes afterwards, where the subject can learn the most and truly engage with the struggle, a dramatization of consciousness raising with a long leftist pedigree. And so, life and art thoroughly blurred, a core principle of Valdés's Brecht-inspired El Teatro Campesino. The young man is fueled up on history. To his delight, he finds that his car starts up again despite its tank having gone dry before. It now runs on Chicanec's inspiration, literalizing the phrase, dale gas. Significantly, this last page uniquely violates the waffle iron pattern. Instead, we have two tiers of the standard size and shape, followed by one more such panel and the rest of the space taken up by a large irregular panel which shows the young man's car speeding off between fields of crops. A sound effect, zoom, trails after him. Open skies and telephone poles recede to infinity, beckoning on his trip to Fresno, where presumably he'll carry on La Lucha. The break from a rigid metrical composition, especially one followed for 8 whole pages by a large frame taking up almost half the real estate, can register a remarkable impact, as Grenstein reminds us. As he phrases it, although any infringement of the regular pattern is significant, it is obvious that the more it departs from the norm, the more it will stand out. In a longer version, I compare this to what Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons do on the final chapter of Watchmen, where they'll have these a series of splash pages, whereas in the previous 11 issues, there had been no splash pages in Watchmen, which only makes those final splash pages all the more powerful and shocking. That's what I'm arguing is kind of something that's going on here. As it does here to emancipatory effect. That disruption of the graphic status quo signals nothing less than the movement reclaimed for the young and passed on. Dale gas, right, literally. Dale gas means let's go, basically. But it also literally means give it gas, give the engine gas. Dale gas. And as in conclusion, I can only say that for some of us in the community, it is music to our eyes. Thank you. That's it. Thank you. Sorry that went long.
No, it was delightful, de verdad, José.
All right.
Delightful, fantástica, vamos. Every time over the years, I can say every new presentation I hear from you is buenísima. So, there is time for questions.
I have two.
Someone from LA has a question. That's great. That makes
Love LA. 2 questions, and the first one, maybe you mentioned this, so sorry. What was their distribution? Like, it was just, like they would photocopy and distribute with their friends? Would they staple it, or?
It was very unconventional. It was very pretty much alternative, and I'm still kind of digging through to see to what extent they were even distributed among other underground kind of networks. For what I've been able to conclude is that it was pretty much confined to the Mexican-American community. Not all of the material is necessarily for kids, and I can certainly see my own grandmother kind of looking at it in shock with words like chingon and things like that. So I don't know to what extent it was necessarily even for kids, but I'm still kind of actually trying to figure that out. Corey, this morning, you actually told me you found it in a bin years later with other undergrounds. So I don't know what that tells us. But yeah, to the extent to which these artists in the 60s and 70s, these Chicanics artists, were actually cross-pollinating or were in conversation with, the Crumbs and the Sheltons and whoever, the Jack Jacksons or whoever, I still haven't quite determined. But there's certainly, this material is not mentioned in all of the popular underground histories like Rosencrantz or folks like that. So I could only assume that it was off the radar for most folks.
Okay, and the second question is specifically about what you've shown. Maybe food for thought. Maybe I don't know if you are already analyzing this, but it was very interesting to me that they're kind of claiming a place, especially in the end. It's like San Joaquin Valley is our home or something, but the whole story is in a car.
That's right.
Yeah, so I don't know. I just found it interesting.
Not the whole story. It's about the car, but mostly they're sitting along the road. Yeah. So, I'm sorry, but please go on. What does that mean for you?
Either like the Smiths the Smith song, "Don't Take Me Home." I don't have any more. I don't have a home anymore. What was it? I'd like to. It would be so beautiful to die right now, hit by a truck. It's a typical The Smith song. It doesn't come the lyrics to myself now. Or claiming the whole space.
Yeah.
Like moving all around, and the whole place is ours. This is our home. It's not a house. It's bigger than that. So either way. I don't know.
I think the latter way is the way that I took it, is that he's going to take this message and it's going to carry on now, because now that his consciousness has been raised. Also, just literally, right? California was literally Mexicans' home that was taken from them after the war of 1846, 48. Yeah. Okay, others?
Thanks a lot. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate you on a great work. It was very meticulous. The analysis was really, really nice and very, very interesting.
Thank you.
My question is, have you had any actual feedback from the community who speaks like this? Because it occurs to me that it can be in any of two directions. Either they can feel like really, really proud, like that you make this analysis and sort of be able to share the way they speak. Or maybe some of them may be a little bit angry, like that you're revealing the secret. This is some sort of a secret language, so you're decoding it to us. So I don't know. Like, what do you think?
That's a great question, and I think partly it has a lot to do with my. I'm going to flail, I guess, but I'm going to flail because I come from a very particular part of the country, the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, where, as I mentioned, it's just kind of normal for people to talk kind of like that. Maybe not the profanity necessarily. I mean, I think Sanchez is good because she differentiates between different kinds of code switching. And Caló, which was the one that I was referring to, is the one that's what the pachucos and the cholos and obviously the gang for people. That's like the one that's the most coarse. But other people are often doing the other kinds of code switching, including my family. So it's. When I've talked to folks about this project, and I've presented some of it to folks down in the valley, to them it just seems normal. It's just like so I don't think like they feel like I'm giving anything away necessarily. There also have been a number of works that I allude to in other media in the larger study. Zoot Suit by Valdés is, I think, the most salient example. 1982 film based on the play Zoot Suit, which he wrote, and then he directs the film. But it is full of Caló and code switching, which has no subtitles. And when I first saw that film as an undergrad, it was a real just brain exploding moment because, to be able to understand what they were saying, and they're using language that I grew up with, but then also not having it explained for all the other white people in the audience, that was like weirdly kind of like affirming in a way. I have shown that film to my students since then, and a number of the non-Spanish speakers tell me they're very alienated and intimidated, and they feel like almost like they're being bullied. And I think that's not far from what Valdés is doing. He really wants you to kind of get a sense of what it's like to be a Spanish speaker in the United States, who can't understand English, and nobody's explaining shit to you. So there is this way in which the movie kind of inverts that for you, and it really turns the table. So to me, there's good. I think, Joe, as we were discussing like that last night, there's good discomfort maybe that can happen in the classroom, depending on how far you want to push it, and when obviously you have to obviously create a space that people feel respected and safe in. But sometimes these artists are trying to push. They're trying to push through that. Thank you for the question.
I loved this presentation so much. So thank you. I just loved all of it. And I love this comic. So I'm interested in labor movement and union organizing comics generally. And I'm wondering whether this is a kind of alternative version of maybe more official comics that were being used to build the membership and educate them, and where this could fit in a kind of labor history of comics for farm workers or more generally, or is this completely their own idea to take are they putting their own spin on organizing comics that already existed, or is it something else completely?
This particular work, Tales from the Barrio, I think, was more, because it was coming from Los Four, and Los Four, of course, is their own thing. They, like I mentioned, they were all art school graduates. They were kind of doing something different. I mean, of course, they were trying to be, authentic, and they want to try to reach out to the people. But there were other folks who were maybe doing stuff that was more, if you will, kind of on the ground. I think I have some other slides here. This is just in case anybody had questions. I was going to bring up some other examples from other works in the book. But this is what I'm talking about. Of course, Andy Zermeño would be the classic example. He was the cartoonist for El Malcriado, which was the Farm Workers Union newspaper. And so he also is the one who created, you can barely see it here, but he also created the Black Eagle icon there for the Farm Workers Union. And he was also a cartoonist. Also, very late in his life, he already passed away, he actually put together a graphic novel in his own. That was really not a form that he had worked in before. But here, I would say, this is where the kind of stuff that I think you're asking about. I don't deal as much with it in the book, because I'm kind of looking at more like other artists like Los Four, who were kind of working in a more urban kind of register, but obviously, folks like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are very much a part of the movement, so they can't ignore it. But in terms of whether they were using comics in quite that explicit kind of, kind of for organizing purposes, like you're saying, I would put that more with Zermeño, people like him. And he was an older artist. He was really more of a cartoonist kind of guy. Thanks. But thank you. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. This has been amazing. You're gonna blow up my reading list right now. One of the things I love about just the story of the Delano strike and the corrido you played is that the corrido in particular opens with Los Filipinos, and we came to help them,
totally.
Right? It's ultimately a story of, as much as it is a story of Chicanx cultural and political identity, it's also one about interethnic alliance, right?
That's right.
And the Delano Grave Strike, and of course, Dolores Huerta is the one who pushed Cesar Chavez into accepting, sort of embracing the undocumented, which of course cuts across ethnicity.
Right.
Do we see
controversial
that energy?
Topic at the time, yeah.
For sure. I mean, and remains so today. Do you see that energy appear anywhere, or is it pretty focused on Chicanismo? Not that would be a disappointment, but I'm just curious. Like,
you mean like more kind of talking about maybe other people outside of the
in a sort of even in an alliance type sense, because the Delano Grave Strike, was at its heart an interethnic alliance.
I mean, here this is probably the best example, but of course they're adapting a pre-existing corrido that Valdés had already written, obviously, taking it from obviously like I said, an earlier source. But again, in this particular work, in Los Fours and Friends' Tales from the Barrio, no. A lot of it is very much about kind of like I said, talking about like this kind of stuff, Saturday Night Bust, or U.S. History Puro Pedo, which is all really more about education and about how kids are being indoctrinated with this false narrative about how great white America is, and so this little kid. So
and that can be applied broadly,
and
right?
those tend to be pretty blunt, right? That he doesn't get into the finer points about Filipino, Mexican American, solidarity. But it is an important. And sometimes, as you know, right? Sometimes that story gets overly simplified, and their role gets kind of erased. There was that movie based on Chavez's life that came out maybe 10 years ago, with what's that guy's name? Manuel Peña. He was the guy who was an Ant-Man, right? But he plays Chavez. And they really kind of erase the Filipinos from that narrative completely. And that's really wrong. That's really not correct. Because, I guess it's too complicated to talk about Mexican Americans and Filipinos. I don't know. I don't know what they were thinking. Okay, thank you.
I loved it too. I want to share the love.
Thank you.
And like I was taunting Joe, I want this book. So I can't wait to see this book.
It's been digitized, so I think...
No, your book.
Oh, my book.
Your book.
Oh, well,
your
you're going to
book.
have to wait a little longer.
Well, both, but your book.
Thank you.
And I have two questions. One is terribly large, I know, and the other is maybe a stretch. But first, a word you used in passing, I wonder if you would bring to the fore Rosquache. In relation to this. That's, I know, terribly large question. And it struck me, I often, because I teach comics and film, and we know now that the links between them are, rich and complicated, I tend to reinforce to my students who see them as, so close and so linked, that comics are static and silent, and films make sound and move. And but you make me think in much more complicated ways about the sort of musical rhythm of a static page or the relationship of sound and image in this relation. And that leads me to ask you about, this is what might be a stretch. One of the things that seems very distinctive about the work of Jaime Hernandez is he relies on a grid. For all his innovations, he rarely plays with the shape of the page. He really relies on the grid. And I wonder if, and of course he's steeped in music, although it's punk more often than anything else. So that may be a stretch, but
it's also Archie comics maybe as well,
Right, but the musical connections tend to be punk. I wonder if, it's fascinated me that an artist with such range and skill as him relies pretty rigorously on the grid, and I wonder if there's something to that.
It would make, nothing would make me happier than people to take maybe this idea, which is not mine. It's coming from folks like Grenstein and other folks who've written about so-called music comics, but to kind of start applying it more widely. For me, I've often, I've often looked down on this kind of design. I don't think of it as that interesting very often. There's exceptions like Watchmen, which of course is brilliant, but I think this is one way to think about how, because it's so regular, because it's so predictable, because it's so kind of, uniform, it has a kind of tempo, and that's the argument, right? And when you kind of marry it to an actual corrido, which itself is kind of repetitive and kind of has a very kind of predictable tempo, the two forms kind of overlap, and that's very much what I think they are doing here, very explicitly. So sure, if we want to take that idea further with other works, I think that would be. I think very often, yes, we've been, at least for me, maybe too wedded to the idea of the static or the silent or the idea of comics kind of happening between the panels in the gutter, which I think is a very important idea that we get from Scott McCloud primarily, right? Most popularly, but I think it maybe makes us a little bit less attentive to maybe the other things that are going on more globally. And, in a larger work, I get a little bit more into the work of a scholar we all know, Charles Hatfield, where he talks about comics as an art of tensions. And I think that's maybe sometimes something to keep in mind, that it can do all of these things. It can do the musicality, it can do the tempo, but then it can also kind of look at, simply a kind of story that's being told. What's notable about this is that it's very, very self-aware and very self-reflexive about how it's using a piece of music that's very well known. Obviously, also a politically important, historically important piece of music. And so the fact that they go for this design rather than some other design also kind of made me start thinking more along the lines of, oh, okay, well, this is what Christine is talking about with the waffle iron, sometimes having a kind of musicality. I don't think I quite understood that until I saw this, actually, and this kind of crystallized it for me. The other thing you mentioned is rascuache, and I know that you've written, I think, very wonderfully about this in regard to the Hernandez brothers. Yes, there's another part of it where I deal more with rascuache, and I think I even maybe talked about it at ICAF, where you and I were on a panel, and I even said I'm very happy that Corey is talking about rascuache, because that's kind of so I don't need to talk about it. But just look at my examples. I mean, right, they're taking all of these popular materials that are out there, whether it's Jack Kirby from '76, and converting it into their own work, completely obviously rascuache being this kind of folk or artistic practice of kind of taking popular materials and reinventing them and reusing them and basically redirecting them. Or whether it is Yolanda Lopez here using a Wonder Woman comic that you can see kind of at the very bottom there. It happens to be this one. And so in the larger study, I don't want to make this about kind of the rest of the book, but in the larger study, I'm kind of looking at episodes like that where you can use things like superhero studies and comic studies to kind of penetrate a little bit more deeply, because the work that has been done on Yolanda Lopez never talks about that. And when they do, they'll say things, and this is a direct quote, they'll say things like, Marvel Comics Superman. Right? So it's the kind of thing that no superhero studies scholar would ever say, right? And so it's telling me that usually these are art historians, that they're not really kind of keying in. They don't really tend to think about superhero comics as actually having people that are making them. They imagine it as a kind of like a factory kind of produced product or something of pop culture or of mass culture. And so that's one thing that I think I try to do. But rascuache is a very central part of it. And I'm not even going to get into this, but this is the example that I talked about in Davenport when we were on the same panel. And again, the way in which Sergio Hernandez, who was another important figure of the 70s, purely a cartoonist. He was not necessarily coming out as much out of the art world as Los Foreign Friends, but he was, again, kind of utilizing kind of various different tags here. Here, in this case, talking about the Chicano moratorium, the march in the early 70s against the Vietnam War, which was broken up by police and got very violent, and there were some deaths, famously. So it is, so rascuache is a part of the story, very much so, but it would take me too far to kind of talk about all of it. Thank you. Others?
I also want to say thank you for coming.
Thank you.
My question relates back to the Filipinos and code switching. My wife is from the Philippines, and we do a lot of code switching in the house and when we go back to the Philippines. And it's kind of weird because it's not just English and Filipino, because there are more than one Filipino language. And there's also Spanish thrown in. So when you had, one of your slides was, I think you pronounced it chisme art?
Chisme arte, yeah.
So my code switching brain is wondering, does that translate as to art gossip?
Yeah, chisme means like gossip. Or
that's how it is in the Philippines. They spell it differently.
Yeah,
but
puro chisme.
They call it chismes.
Yeah, right. And this was the journal which originally some of these comics first appeared in, and then they were later collected into the booklet that I talk about. But and this is actually a kind of more famous, because it wasn't just, obviously it was comics was just one part of it. There was art and poetry and other things. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, but again, a lot of the material, and actually Chicanx literature is itself kind of distinguished by the free use of code switching.
It happens a lot in the Filipino comics too.
Yeah. I mean, and you can see though how this, I guess you could look at it in two different ways. Like I said, it's a very, very affirming, even life affirming kind of thing when I see it. At the same time, it kind of ghettoizes you. Because that material is not going to be accessible to larger audiences. So you're kind of, in a sense, sort of painting yourself into a bit of a corner. I think these works are engaging, enough in and of themselves as comics to kind of break through that. But yeah, but I think it's better than the alternative. I love Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and I watch them obsessively. But I was always been just really irate at how horrible the Spanish is in those in those things. I mean, it's clearly written. It's been written in English and then put through Google translators. That's how bad it sounds. It does not sound like real Spanish until what is his name? Dalton, Tom Dalton, the character who plays the main kind of villain in the latter seasons of Better Call Saul. I think Tony Dalton. That's his name. And I understand he actually talked to the producers and said, your Spanish sounds like shit in the series. And he actually spoke very good, very good Spanish, very, very authentic sounding stuff, the way that you would expect someone like him to talk. And so that's, but you have to wait until like season 4 or 5 for that to happen. So that's kind of that's the context, it seems to me. That's in a sense what we're dealing with. And this, of course, is Chisme Arte and Los Four and Friends, Tales from the Barrio is literally a world away from that. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Imagine people are getting hungry.
Sorry for holding everyone up, but I also want to thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
I understand what you're saying about like ghettoizing when it comes to mobilizing certain
that's maybe not the most felicitous term that I use. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I think it's appropriate. Like it sequesters the audience of the comic off into those who are engaged with this mode of literacy, who like can render these comics legible. Do you think that's something that happens with the visual codes in the comics as well? I noticed when you described earlier the police officer that arrests the children as a demon, that the protagonist, the character in the first page, the first panel of that comic, looked like the devil.
Yeah. You know, I realized in the middle of this, I think I was talking about this panel. So that the cop's face kind of expands to fill up the whole, kind of.
And then again in the bottom,
he's
rendered like a bat with the pig nose. But if you go back to the previous page, I think, the character in the top left.
That's not a cop. That's just one of the dudes.
Yeah, but I think the fact that he, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think he looks a little bit like a devil caricature.
Right. Yeah.
Inscribes a sort of visual code where, the devil caricature, first of all, is not evil, is mischievous maybe, but is part of the gang.
Yeah. It's like they're doing bad stuff. They're gonna do some drugs, they're gonna go fuck around. Yeah.
Yeah. It reminded me of the devil in commodity fetishism, the way that Tausig argues that the devil as a visual code becomes a part of the literacy and language of understanding certain messages regarding capitalism and subjectivity. The reader is sort of placed alongside this devil character, and then later the cop is rendered as a demon with, again, the pig nose and the bat ears.
I think you're talking about, and I'll have to learn your name because I think I'm going to have to mention this in the footnotes, because that's, I think, a very productive way of looking at it. Couple of things. It speaks to the kind of the flexible nature of devil imagery, that it can be like, hey, we're going to have some fun and we're going to do stuff, illicit, kind of activities. The other thing is that in this particular image, and that they're just trying to differentiate, right? Because he kind of looks the same here. He's got the pronounced nose and the pronounced chin. I think it's also maybe a reference, it might be, to La Loteria, right? Which has the different, the Mexican bingo kind of cards that has the El Diablito, which looks a little bit like him. Maybe that's a little bit of a game. I can ask that Leo Limon is still available, and so I can maybe ask him if he was thinking along those lines. But then the other thing, you're right, is that you're saying, but it's very different when you talk about cops being demonic and being devilish and brutalizing them. I mean, obviously there's no positive connotation. So thank you. That's great. Had not thought about that.
Thank you so much with this wonderful presentation and wonderful questions. Thank you, todo el mundo. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. We will see each other back at 3 o'clock. Yep. For Mari Naomi presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you.